Verstappen reacted in less than a second, and that single decision may have just exposed the biggest hidden danger in Formula One right now. Because days before Bearman's terrifying crash, Verstappen faced almost the exact same situation. Same track, same type of moment, same unpredictable behavior. But he escaped. Bearman didn't. And here's the part that's making teams seriously worried. The data shows this wasn't driver error. It was something inside the car. Something that can suddenly change speed, change direction, without warning. Bearman hit the wall with a force of 50 g, 50 times his own body weight in a split second. And now insiders believe Verstappen already saw the warning signs before it happened. So the real question is not what caused the crash. The real question is, how many drivers have already been at risk without even realizing it? Stay with me, and subscribe to the channel, because what Verstappen revealed behind that accident changes everything. At first, nobody connected the dots. That's what makes this so unsettling. Because if you go back to that practice session, it looks like nothing more than a minor inconvenience. A fast car approaching. A slower car ahead. A driver forced to lift. We've seen it hundreds of times. But this one was different. And Verstappen felt it instantly. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't happen. He expected the car ahead to move aside, to behave in a predictable way, to follow the unwritten rule every driver relies on. But it didn't. It stayed on the line just a fraction longer than expected. And that fraction, at over 300 kilometers per hour, is everything. Now here's the detail most people missed. Verstappen didn't hesitate. He didn't try to force the move. He didn't gamble. He backed out immediately. Which tells you something critical. He recognized the risk before it fully developed. Almost instinctively. And that instinct is built on experience, on patterns, on understanding how cars behave. So when something feels off, even slightly, drivers like Verstappen react without thinking. But here's where this gets deeper. Because what he avoided in that moment was not just a potential collision. It was uncertainty. And that uncertainty is exactly what Bearman faced days later. But in a much worse position. Because Bearman wasn't reacting early. He was already committed. Already alongside. Already inside the move. And when the unexpected happened, there was no way out. Now think about the contrast. Verstappen lifts early. Avoids the situation. Keeps control. Bearman commits fully. Trusts the behavior ahead. And pays the price. Same type of scenario. Completely different outcome. And that difference comes down to one thing. Timing. But timing alone doesn't explain everything. Because there's another layer here. One that teams are only now starting to talk about openly. During that practice incident, Colapinto was not just driving slowly. He was managing energy, warming tires, balancing systems. And in modern Formula One, that process is not always smooth, not always linear. Sometimes, it creates small inconsistencies, tiny fluctuations in speed, subtle changes in behavior, almost invisible, unless you're the driver behind, closing in at extreme speed. And this is where Verstappen's reaction becomes so important. Because he didn't just avoid contact. He identified something unusual. Something that didn't match the pattern he expected. And instead of questioning it, he trusted his instinct. He lifted. He survived the moment. But Bearman never got that chance. Because by the time he realized something was wrong, it was already too late. And that's what makes this so dangerous. Not the mistake. Not the move. But the delay in recognizing that something isn't right. Now imagine this happening again. Different corner. Different drivers. Same underlying issue. A car behaving slightly differently than expected. A driver committing based on normal patterns. And suddenly, that pattern breaks. That's not racing anymore. That's unpredictability. And in a sport built on precision, that is the one thing nobody wants. Which is why, after the race, Verstappen's quiet reaction started to gain attention. Because he didn't celebrate avoiding the incident. He didn't exaggerate it. He simply described it. Calmly. Clearly. He expected one thing. He got another. And he adapted. That's it. But now, with Bearman's crash in the background, that simple explanation feels much bigger. Because it suggests this wasn't random. It wasn't isolated. It was already happening. Already visible. Just not fully understood. And that leads to a question that keeps coming back inside the paddock. If Verstappen noticed it early, how many others felt it too? And said nothing? Inside the paddock, the conversation started to change. Not publicly. Not in interviews. But in private. Because drivers began comparing something very specific. Moments. Small ones. almost forgettable. But now, impossible to ignore. Little hesitations on straights. Unexpected drops in speed. Cars that didn't accelerate the same way twice. At first, they sounded unrelated. Different teams. Different setups. Different laps. But when you put them together, a pattern starts to form. And this is where Verstappen's moment becomes even more important. Because he didn't just experience it. He reacted to it perfectly. Before it escalated. Before it turned into something uncontrollable. Which is exactly what didn't happen to Bearman. Now here's the part that makes engineers uncomfortable. Because when they went back to the data, they didn't just analyze the crash. They compared it. Session by session. Driver by driver. Looking for similarities. And they found something subtle. But consistent. Energy deployment wasn't stable. Not always. Not under certain conditions. There were moments where the system entered a critical state. A state where power delivery changes suddenly. Not smoothly. Not predictably. And in that moment, the car doesn't behave the way the driver expects. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough to delay acceleration. Enough to slightly alter balance. Enough to change a racing line. And at high speed, that is more than enough. Because Formula One is not about big mistakes. It's about tiny margins. Milliseconds. Centimeters. And when those margins are affected by something outside the driver's control, the entire equation changes. This is exactly what Bearman described. A huge closing speed. A car ahead behaving unexpectedly. No time to react. And suddenly, Verstappen's earlier moment doesn't feel like coincidence anymore. It feels like a warning. A preview. Something that showed the problem before it fully revealed itself. But here's where things become even more serious. Because the FIA didn't just review the incident as a racing situation. They opened a deeper investigation. A technical one. Focused entirely on the behavior of the cars. Not the drivers. And that decision alone tells you everything. Because when Formula One starts questioning the machines, it means something fundamental is at risk. Now think about what that implies. Drivers are no longer just managing tires, fuel, strategy. They are now dealing with systems that can introduce uncertainty at the worst possible moments. And that creates a completely new kind of pressure. Because you can't train for unpredictability. You can't simulate it perfectly. You can't anticipate something that shouldn't happen. And yet, it's happening. Quietly, intermittently, but consistently enough to raise concern. This is why Verstappen's reaction stands out so much. Because he trusted his instinct over the system. He didn't assume everything would behave normally. He expected the unexpected. And that mindset may have saved him from a situation identical to Bearman's. But that raises an even bigger question. If avoiding this kind of danger now depends on instinct, on reacting before things go wrong, then what happens when there is no time to react? What happens when the system fails? At the exact moment a driver is fully committed? Because that's exactly what happened at Suzuka. And if nothing changes, there is no guarantee it won't happen again. Which means, the real issue is no longer what Verstappen avoided. It's what the sport might not be able to prevent next time. And this is where the story reaches its most uncomfortable point. Because for the first time, drivers are starting to question something they never questioned before. Not each other. Not strategy. Not even the limits of the car. But control itself. Who is really in control when everything happens at full speed? Because Formula One has always been built on one fundamental belief. The driver decides. The driver reacts. The driver controls the outcome. But what Suzuka revealed is that this might not always be true anymore. And Verstappen understood that before anyone else said it out loud. Now imagine sitting in that cockpit. 300 kilometers per hour. Milliseconds to react. You commit to a move based on everything you know. Everything you've learned. Every pattern you trust. And suddenly, the car ahead behaves differently. Not because the driver chose to, but because the system forced it to. That changes everything. Because now you're not racing a person. You're reacting to a variable you cannot predict. And that's where fear begins. Not panic. Not chaos. Something much more dangerous. Doubt. Because once doubt enters a driver's mind, every decision slows down. Every move becomes uncertain. Every overtake becomes a risk calculation. And in Formula One, that hesitation is the difference between control and disaster. This is why what Verstappen showed matters so much. He didn't just avoid a crash. He exposed the moment where trust breaks. The exact point where instinct has to override expectation. And that's not how Formula One is supposed to work. Because if drivers start relying more on instinct than on the behavior of the cars around them, then the entire structure of racing begins to shift. Now here's the part that nobody is saying publicly, but everyone is thinking. What happens in a title fight? Final laps. Minimal margins. Maximum pressure. Two drivers going wheel to wheel. No room for hesitation. No space for error. And suddenly, one car behaves unpredictably. Just slightly. Just enough. Who takes the blame? The driver? Or the system? Because right now, there is no clear answer. And that uncertainty is exactly what the FIA is trying to understand. Behind closed doors, analyzing data, reconstructing scenarios, trying to find a way to eliminate something that was never supposed to exist. But the deeper they look, the more complicated it becomes. Because this isn't a single failure. It's a chain. Energy management, power delivery, system response, all interacting in ways that are not always linear, not always stable, and under certain conditions, not fully predictable. Which brings us back to Suzuka. Back to that moment. Lap 22. Spoon corner. Bearman commits. Trusts what he sees. And in less than a second, that trust is broken. The car moves. The space disappears. The crash becomes inevitable. Now connect that to Verstappen. Days earlier. Same circuit. Different moment. Same underlying issue. But this time, he steps away. He avoids it. He reads the situation before it develops. And that difference is the only reason we are talking about one crash instead of two. But here's the final piece. The one that ties everything together. Because Bearman said something after the accident that changes how you see all of this. He said this is exactly what drivers feared could happen. And now, it has happened. That's not speculation. That's confirmation. This wasn't unexpected. It was inevitable. And Verstappen, without crashing, without headlines, was the first to show the warning signs. Which leaves Formula One with a problem it cannot ignore. Because if the drivers already knew, if the signs were already there, if the system is already showing cracks, then the real question is no longer what happened in Japan. The real question is, what happens next time, when there is no Verstappen to back out early, and no margin left to survive?